There are people who can stand beside you, share your life, and yet feel like they are always just out of reach. They smile, they touch, they speak, but something in them remains hidden, untouchable, as if there is a locked door inside their soul that no key can open. You may feel them slipping away in quiet, unspoken ways, not through fights or goodbyes, but through subtle silences, withheld emotions, and a fading warmth that you can't quite name. This is not absence in the physical sense, but absence in the heart, the slow pulling away of someone who fears losing themselves more than they fear losing you. Fear of engulfment and the illusion of safety arise from a deep, often unarticulated conviction that intimacy carries within it a hidden danger, one that threatens not just comfort, but the very sense of self. For the avoidant, closeness is not simply the act of being with another. It is a merging of emotional landscapes, an intertwining of needs, expectations, and vulnerabilities that can feel like the slow erosion of their individuality. This is not a fear that is born in the present moment, but rather one that has its roots in early experiences, where closeness may have been unpredictable, overwhelming, or conditional. When a person grows up in an environment where emotional presence came at the cost of personal autonomy, the mind learns to equate love with surrender, connection with loss, and attachment with entrapment. As a result, the body and mind develop strategies to maintain a sense of separateness, strategies that later manifest as avoidance in adult relationships. The avoidant psyche builds an inner fortress, one with high walls that allow just enough connection to keep the bond alive, but never enough to threaten their independence. At first glance, this might appear as confidence or self-reliance, but beneath it lies a guarded stance, one that measures every emotional step as though entering deeper intimacy were walking into a trap. In the early stages of a relationship, this fear may be dormant, hidden under the excitement of discovery, the novelty of attraction, and the illusion of control. But as emotional demands grow, as the relationship calls for greater vulnerability, the walls begin to rise again, almost instinctively. This is the point at which fear of engulfment takes shape, not in dramatic gestures of rejection, but in subtle shifts, in pauses where there used to be openness, in silences that replace words. What makes this fear so potent is its invisibility to both the avoidant and their partner. On the surface, it may seem like the avoidant is simply busy, distracted, or needing space, but internally, the experience is more primal. They feel the subtle pull toward dependency, the unspoken invitation to merge emotionally, and it triggers a deep unease. Their mind whispers that allowing someone too close will lead to a gradual dissolution of their own identity, that their thoughts, feelings, and desires will be overshadowed or absorbed by the other person's needs. In this way, emotional closeness becomes conflated with a kind of psychological captivity. To preserve what they perceive as safety, they begin to regulate the rhythm of closeness and distance. They will allow moments of connection, but only when they feel fully in control of the terms. This dynamic is rarely conscious, yet it forms the silent backbone of how they relate. They may become more private, revealing less of their inner world, or they may redirect the focus of conversations to neutral or external topics. In essence, they begin to ration intimacy, offering it in doses small enough to prevent them from feeling overtaken. This illusion of safety is powerful because it is self-reinforcing. By keeping others at arm's length, the avoidant feels secure, unthreatened, and in control. The absence of deep vulnerability creates the sense that they are safe from being engulfed, even though the very act of maintaining this distance keeps them from experiencing the nourishment that comes from genuine emotional intimacy. This safety, however, is not real safety. It is the avoidance of risk, and in that avoidance they trade the possibility of deep connection for the comfort of emotional autonomy. Yet, to the avoidant, this trade feels necessary, even wise, because it preserves their sense of self intact, untouched, and impenetrable. In their world, love is safer at a distance, and closeness must always be tempered by the boundaries that keep them whole. In relationships, vulnerability is the lifeblood of emotional connection, the invisible thread that binds two people in mutual trust and openness. It is in the exchange of inner truths, in the willingness to be seen in both strength and fragility, that intimacy deepens and becomes enduring. For the avoidant, however, vulnerability is not a bridge to safety, but a risk that threatens their equilibrium. They approach it cautiously, as though stepping onto unstable ground, testing its strength only to retreat at the first sign that it might collapse beneath them. This retreat is not usually dramatic or sudden. It unfolds quietly, almost imperceptibly, through the gradual erosion of openness. Conversations that once flowed freely begin to feel constrained, personal disclosures become rare, and emotional reactions are tempered or concealed. The avoidant mind begins to dismantle the bridge of vulnerability plank by plank until the connection feels less like a shared path and more like two separate shores with widening waters between them. This dismantling often begins when the relationship shifts from the stage of novelty to a phase where deeper emotional investment is required. In the beginning, there is safety in surface-level disclosure because the stakes feel lower and the sense of control remains intact. But as the partner seeks more understanding, more shared emotional depth, more reciprocity, the avoidant experiences an internal tightening. They sense that the openness required is not temporary, but ongoing. That true closeness will require sustained exposure of their inner world. This triggers the defense mechanisms they have long relied on, prompting them to withdraw just enough to reduce the perceived threat without severing the bond entirely. The process is subtle enough that even they may not fully recognize it. Instead of openly rejecting emotional vulnerability, they may redirect conversations towards safe, practical matters, work, schedules, external events. Anything that does not demand an exploration of personal fears, insecurities, or emotional needs. Humor, intellectualizing, or even silence become tools to sidestep the deeper currents of intimacy. This is not indifference. It is self-protection. The avoidant's discomfort with emotional exposure is rooted in the belief that once someone truly knows them, they will either be judged, controlled, or ultimately abandoned. Vulnerability feels like opening the door to pain, so they keep the door partially shut, even with those they care about most. Over time, this slow erosion creates a distance that is difficult to bridge. The partner may sense the emotional withdrawal and attempt to draw the avoidant closer through questions, reassurances, or expressions of love. But these attempts can paradoxically deepen the avoidant's withdrawal. The more they feel pressure to reveal themselves, the more they retreat to preserve the boundaries that feel essential to their stability. What once was a mutual exchange becomes lopsided, with one person offering more of their inner life and the other keeping theirs carefully guarded. This pattern is reinforced by the temporary relief the avoidant feels when they withhold vulnerability. By avoiding the perceived dangers of deep emotional exposure, they maintain a sense of self-containment and autonomy. Yet, this relief comes at a cost. The partner may begin to feel unseen, unheard, or disconnected, and the emotional foundation of the relationship weakens. Ironically, the very withdrawal intended to protect the avoidant from emotional harm can set in motion the very loss they fear, whether that loss is through emotional alienation or eventual separation. Still, to the avoidant, the preservation of their internal boundaries feels like a necessary safeguard, a way to keep themselves whole in a world where closeness often feels synonymous with surrender. When emotional intimacy begins to feel unsafe for the avoidant, the sphere of sexual connection is rarely left untouched. Sexuality, in its most profound form, is not merely a physical act, but a merging of emotional, psychological, and physical presence. It is a moment where the body speaks what the mind often cannot, where vulnerability is not just expressed in words but in the surrender of physical barriers. For the avoidant, this level of closeness can feel overwhelming because it mirrors the same risks they perceive in emotional intimacy, only amplified through touch and physical closeness. The act of sex requires not only physical availability, but also a degree of trust, openness, and the willingness to be fully present. To someone who associates deep closeness with danger or loss of autonomy, this can feel like stepping into an unguarded space where they risk being overtaken by another's needs or expectations. As this fear begins to surface, sexual withdrawal often becomes a way to re-establish a sense of safety. This withdrawal may not happen abruptly, but instead emerges in gradual shifts: less initiation, decreased enthusiasm, or a shift in the tone of intimacy from emotionally charged to more mechanical or transactional. They may still participate physically, but the emotional resonance fades, turning the experience into something more controlled and less exposing. The physical act becomes stripped of its deeper meaning, serving instead as a way to fulfill a role or maintain appearances while avoiding the vulnerability that comes with genuine sexual closeness. Sometimes the withdrawal takes the form of reduced frequency, justified by external factors such as stress, fatigue, or lack of time. These explanations are not always untrue, but they mask the underlying discomfort with the intimacy sex demands. By keeping the physical connection limited, the avoidant maintains emotional distance and reinforces the psychological walls that help them feel secure. The bedroom, which could be a space of renewal and emotional bonding, instead becomes another arena where control over closeness is maintained through careful regulation of access. This sexual distancing can also be linked to a deeper fear that sexual intimacy will inevitably draw them into emotional entanglement. For the avoidant, physical intimacy and emotional intimacy are not easily separated. One often leads to the other. Engaging in fully present, emotionally connected sex would require them to drop the very defenses they believe protect them from engulfment or dependency. In their mind, avoiding sexual vulnerability is a safeguard against the deeper emotional vulnerability that might follow. In some cases, the avoidant may shift the nature of sexual encounters to reduce the emotional weight attached to them. They might prioritize quick, less intimate acts over slower, more emotionally charged experiences, or they may disengage from post-intimacy closeness, such as cuddling or deep conversation. These behaviors allow them to participate in the act without fully opening themselves to its potential for emotional bonding. The partner may sense this shift as a form of rejection, interpreting the lack of warmth or emotional reciprocity as a loss of attraction, when in truth, it is often a protective maneuver rather than an absence of desire. Over time, this sexual withdrawal reinforces the same dynamic seen in emotional distancing. The avoidant feels more secure in their autonomy, while the partner feels increasingly disconnected and possibly undesired. This creates a feedback loop in which the partner's expressions of longing, confusion, or frustration are perceived as pressure, prompting even further withdrawal. What began as an attempt to preserve a sense of safety ends up deepening the divide, making genuine intimacy, both emotional and sexual, feel increasingly out of reach, even though beneath the avoidance lies the unspoken truth that the longing for connection has never truly disappeared. When the avoidant begins to feel the weight of emotional demands, they often respond by redirecting their energy away from the relationship into domains they perceive as safer and more controllable. This is the essence of emotional numbing, not the complete absence of feeling, but the deliberate dampening of emotional intensity so that closeness no longer feels threatening. It is a form of self-regulation that minimizes the risk of being overwhelmed, achieved not through confrontation, but through quiet withdrawal into activities that do not require emotional exposure. The avoidant learns to substitute emotional engagement with pursuits where their autonomy is preserved and where the unpredictability of human intimacy is absent. Work becomes an absorbing refuge. Hobbies evolve into near obsessions. Solitary routines become sacred spaces, and even mundane tasks take on disproportionate importance because they offer control and certainty. This displacement of energy is often subtle at first, and to an outside observer it may look like admirable dedication, focus, or passion. The partner may initially interpret this shift as a temporary need for space or productivity, unaware that it is also a protective mechanism. The avoidant is not merely seeking distraction, they are actively regulating the depth of emotional involvement by investing their energy where emotional risk is minimal. In these activities, they experience a kind of emotional neutrality, neither the high vulnerability of intimacy nor the anxiety of relational demands, but a steady, predictable state in which they feel safe. This safety, however, is not born of connection. It is born of withdrawal. Emotional numbing also allows the avoidant to remain physically present in the relationship while reducing their psychological presence. They may still engage in daily interactions, fulfill responsibilities, and maintain outward appearances, but the emotional core of the relationship receives less of their authentic engagement. The partner might notice that conversations become more surface level, that affection feels less spontaneous, and that shared moments are increasingly overshadowed by the avoidant's preoccupation with external commitments. The relationship begins to feel like a place of coexistence rather than deep connection. This pattern is reinforced because emotional numbing offers immediate relief from the discomfort of vulnerability. By channeling emotional and sexual energy into other domains, the avoidant avoids the inner tension that arises when closeness feels unsafe. The relief is real, but it comes with a cost that often goes unacknowledged: the slow erosion of intimacy. Over time, the partner may feel like they are competing with the avoidant's work, hobbies, or personal routines for attention and emotional presence. The avoidant, on the other hand, may perceive the partner's attempts to re-engage as intrusions into their safe zones, further strengthening their belief that distance is necessary for self-preservation. In its deeper form, emotional numbing is not just a behavioral choice, but a psychological state that can blunt not only negative emotions but also the capacity to fully experience joy, passion, and desire. The same defenses that protect the avoidant from pain also limit their access to the richness of emotional life. They trade intensity for stability, but the stability is a quiet, muted existence that keeps true intimacy at bay. This displacement becomes a cycle. The more they invest in emotionally safe activities, the more distant they feel from their partner, and the more they rely on those activities to avoid the discomfort of that distance. While this state may feel like balance to the avoidant, it is in truth a delicate equilibrium sustained by avoidance rather than authentic connection, one that can collapse the moment external distractions no longer suffice to shield them from the emotional realities of the relationship. The mask of self-sufficiency is one of the avoidant's most well-crafted defenses, a carefully maintained image that communicates independence, resilience, and emotional self-containment. On the surface, it appears as confidence and strength, a refusal to rely on others for validation or emotional stability. Beneath this presentation, however, is a deep fear that allowing themselves to need or depend on someone will lead to disappointment, loss, or loss of self-control. The mask does not simply shield them from others, It also convinces them that they truly do not require emotional or sexual closeness to feel complete. This belief becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, where detachment is framed as a natural preference rather than a protective adaptation born from past relational wounds. In practice, this self-sufficiency manifests in subtle but consistent ways. The avoidant may downplay moments of vulnerability, brushing aside offers of comfort with statements that they are fine or don't need help. They may decline emotional support during difficult times, not because it is unwelcome in principle, but because accepting it would mean exposing the soft underbelly of their emotional world. This withholding is not limited to crisis moments. It also appears in everyday interactions where the partner reaches for connection. Expressions of love may be met with quiet acknowledgement rather than reciprocity. Deep emotional disclosures might be received with intellectual responses, and requests for closeness may be reframed as unnecessary demands. The result is a relational dynamic where the partner feels they are leaning towards someone who refuses to lean back, creating a subtle imbalance of intimacy. Sexually, the mask of self-sufficiency often carries over into a stance of emotional detachment during intimacy. The avoidant may engage physically while keeping their emotional guard intact, ensuring that even the most physically vulnerable moments do not compromise their perceived independence. They may convince themselves that their needs are minimal or that their partner's desire for connection is excessive, reframing closeness as optional rather than essential. By maintaining this stance, they protect themselves from the possibility of being let down if the intimacy is not sustained, while also avoiding the risk of needing it too much. Part of the power of this mask lies in how it subtly places the burden of adaptation on the partner. When someone projects unwavering independence, the other person may begin to question their own needs, wondering if they are too demanding or emotionally dependent. This dynamic can lead to the partner suppressing their own expressions of affection or vulnerability to match the avoidant's emotional pace. Over time, this creates an emotional climate where genuine closeness becomes scarce, not because it is explicitly rejected, but because the atmosphere quietly discourages it. The mask of self-sufficiency is also reinforced internally by the avoidant's belief that it is safer to rely solely on oneself. They may recall past experiences where vulnerability led to rejection, manipulation, or emotional harm, using these memories as evidence that autonomy is the only reliable source of security. This self-reliance becomes a source of pride and identity, making it difficult for them to see how it also limits their ability to connect deeply. By viewing closeness as an optional luxury rather than a fundamental human need, they unintentionally cut themselves off from the full depth of intimacy that a relationship could offer. While the mask may protect them from the unpredictability of emotional and sexual intimacy, it also prevents them from experiencing the profound security that comes from mutual dependence. The belief that they must stand alone keeps them from leaning into the very connections that could offer healing. Yet, to the avoidant, the mask feels not only protective, but necessary, as if lowering it even slightly would invite the risk of being consumed by another's needs or losing the independence they have fought so hard to maintain. The cycle of withdrawal and reinforcement begins the moment an avoidant feels the tension between their partner's desire for closeness and their own need for emotional space. This tension acts as a trigger, activating the deep-seated belief that intimacy, while desirable on the surface, carries hidden risks of entrapment, dependency, or eventual loss. When this belief surfaces, the avoidant instinctively pulls back, sometimes in subtle ways and sometimes in more noticeable shifts. They might reduce emotional sharing, limit physical intimacy, or create physical and mental barriers through busyness or distraction. This initial withdrawal is not always an act of rejection, but rather an attempt to restore a sense of balance and autonomy that they feel is being threatened. From the partner's perspective, this retreat can feel confusing or even hurtful, leading them to seek reassurance by pursuing more connection. They may increase their expressions of affection, ask more questions, initiate deeper conversations, or seek more physical intimacy to close the perceived gap. While these actions are often motivated by love and the desire to maintain closeness, the avoidant interprets them through a defensive lens. Instead of experiencing these gestures as comfort, they may perceive them as pressure, a demand for intimacy that exceeds their emotional tolerance in the moment. This perception strengthens their belief that too much closeness is suffocating, prompting them to pull back further. Each cycle reinforces the avoidant's internal narrative. The more they withdraw, the more their partner pursues. The more their partner pursues, the more suffocated they feel. Over time, this dynamic becomes self-perpetuating. The avoidant's withdrawal validates their own fear that closeness leads to discomfort, while the partner's increased pursuit validates the avoidant's need to protect their independence. Both sides become caught in a loop where each person's instinctive response feeds the other's deepest fears. For the avoidant, the withdrawal feels like self-preservation. For the partner, it feels like abandonment. The reinforcement phase also strengthens the avoidant's long-term coping strategies. Once they see that pulling away reduces the immediate pressure for intimacy, the avoidant mind stores this as evidence that distance is the best way to maintain safety in relationships. This can lead to increasingly preemptive withdrawal, avoiding certain conversations, keeping emotions in check, or limiting sexual intimacy before it even feels threatening, all to prevent the cycle from starting in the first place. While this reduces short-term discomfort, it deepens the long-term disconnect, creating a relationship environment where true emotional and sexual closeness becomes rare. What makes this cycle so difficult to break is that it often happens without full awareness from either person. The avoidant may not consciously recognize that their distancing behaviors are rooted in fear, and the partner may not see that their pursuit is interpreted as pressure. Instead, both sides respond to the emotional climate instinctively, each trying to meet their own needs without realizing they are unintentionally feeding the very pattern they wish to escape. The more this cycle repeats, the more entrenched it becomes, until it starts to define the rhythm of the relationship itself. The result is a slow erosion of intimacy, where moments of closeness become brief and fragile, easily disrupted by the avoidant's instinct to protect their autonomy and the partner's instinct to restore connection. Both may begin to feel emotionally tired, the avoidant from constantly managing their boundaries, and the partner from repeatedly trying to bridge a gap that never fully closes. While this cycle is not rooted in a lack of care or love, it functions as a closed system that continually affirms the avoidant's belief that distance is safer than closeness, ultimately leaving both partners feeling unseen and unfulfilled even in the presence of one another. Avoidants withdraw not from lack of love, but from a deep-seated belief that distance is the only way to feel safe while still longing for connection.